My daughter-in-law left for a 1-week retreat suitcase packed neatly schedule, set smile perfectly in place as always. I stood in the kitchen watching her car roll past the iron gate, a cup of coffee still warm in my hands. The moment she was gone, my son, who was supposed to be in a wheelchair, walked into the kitchen and said, "We need to leave. Right now." I dropped the coffee and followed him through the back garden down to the wooden dock by the river. The second we stepped onto it, he opened his laptop and turned it toward me. And in that moment, everything I had believed for years began to collapse. Thank you for staying with me. Before we go further, let me know where you're watching from, your city, your country, anywhere in the world. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Also, please note, some parts of this story are fictionalized for narrative purposes. Any similarities are purely coincidental, but the message is something to reflect on. The coffee was good that morning. I don't know why I remember that so clearly, but I do. It was the first thing I noticed standing alone in the kitchen of my Charleston estate, watching the early April light push through the tall windows and fall across the stone countertop in long, pale ribbons. The coffee I had made for myself was smooth. No bitterness at the back of the throat, no faint aftertaste that I'd never quite been able to name. Just coffee the way it was supposed to taste. I stood there with the mug in both hands and thought strange. For the better part of 7 years, I'd been waking up to something that never sat quite right. Not the house was beautiful. A 3-story estate in the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina, with iron gates along the front, live oaks spreading their arms over the driveway, and a back garden that ran down to a private dock on the Cooper River. I'd built a career for 40 years running a construction development firm, and when I finally stepped back in 2017, this house was what all of it had been for. But somewhere along the way, the mornings had started to feel heavier than they should. My thinking had grown slower, like a radio losing its signal. I'd blamed age, I'd blamed grief over Colin. I'd blamed the particular kind of exhaustion that comes with watching your son lose the use of his legs and not being able to do a single thing about it. What I hadn't considered, what I couldn't seem to hold on to long enough to examine, was that the fog might not be coming from inside me at all. I heard Natalie before I saw her. The sound of wheels on hardwood, not a wheelchair, but the compact, deliberate roll of a carry-on suitcase came down the main staircase at 7:45 that morning. She moved the way she always moved, precise, unhurried, like every action had been rehearsed the night before. My daughter-in-law was 38 years old, with dark hair pulled back smooth, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd never once slouched in a chair. She'd come into our lives 6 years ago as Colin's physical therapist, then his companion, then within 18 months, his wife. She was capable, organized, always composed. She set her suitcase near the front door and came into the kitchen to find me at the counter. "Your 9 o'clock is the small white pill," she said, opening the weekly medication organizer she kept on the shelf beside the refrigerator. She set today's compartment on the counter in front of me with 2 fingers the way you'd place a document for someone to sign. "And don't skip the afternoon one. You know what happens when you skip it." "I know," I said. She smiled. It was a complete smile. The corners of her mouth moved correctly. Her teeth showed her head tilted just slightly to the right. Everything a smile was supposed to do. But her eyes stayed exactly where they were, flat and focused, as though the expression had been applied from the outside rather than built from within. "I'll be back from Scottsdale on Sunday," she said. "The Whitmore Wellness Resort, I gave the number to the house phone in case your cell goes out." "You've mentioned it 3 times this week," I said, just being thorough. She picked up her handbag from the back of a chair. "There's food in the freezer. Mrs. Alderman from the agency will come Tuesday and Thursday. Colin's regimen is all written on the board upstairs." She didn't kiss my cheek. She didn't pause at the doorway. She walked to the front door, collected the handle of her suitcase, and stepped out into the morning. The door closed behind her with a soft final click, the sound of something being sealed rather than simply shut. I stood at the window and watched her load the bag into the back of her silver sedan. She checked her phone, once tucked it into her jacket pocket, and got in. The car reversed down the driveway and disappeared past the iron gate. The house was quiet. I picked up my coffee and drank. For a while I just stood there. I thought about the medication organizer on the shelf and the way she'd set this morning's pills in front of me without asking if I wanted them. I thought about Dr. Paulson, the physician I'd had for 20 years, who'd retired in 2019, and recommended Natalie's chosen replacement, a Dr. Harmon, who ran a private practice on the other side of town. In 6 years of appointments, I had never once spoken to Dr. Harmon alone. Natalie drove me sat in the waiting room and was always present when the doctor came in. Family support, she called it, making sure nothing gets lost in translation. I had thought that was considerate of her, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that tasted clean and right. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I found myself thinking about it differently. But the thought was slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Every time I brought it forward, something else in my mind would push back a tired voice that said, "Walter, you're getting old. You're suspicious of everything. You're not well. That's why she helps." I set down the mug and shook my head. That's why she helps. I had told myself that 100 times, maybe 1,000. I was still standing at the counter when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft drag and thud rhythm I'd learned to listen for over 7 years. The sound of a man shifting his weight in a chair, repositioning himself against the back of a wheelchair. These were footsteps, heel to toe. Steady, deliberate, and completely real, moving down the upstairs hallway above my head. I turned toward the kitchen doorway and did not move. The footsteps descended the staircase, each step placed with a kind of quiet, measured patience that made the hair on my arms rise. And then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. Colin, my son. 41 years old with his mother's dark eyes and my jaw, and God help me standing upright. Both feet on the floor. No wheelchair behind him, no crutches, no brace. His shoulders were squared. His gaze was steady. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone they've been waiting years to speak to. For a moment, I couldn't say anything at all. My mind reached for explanations and found none that made sense. I had watched this man be lifted from a stretcher 7 years ago. I had sat beside his hospital bed for 11 days. I had signed forms and spoken to surgeons and held his hand when he'd been told that the nerve damage might be permanent. And he was standing in my kitchen. My voice came out wrong. Too quiet, too careful. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took my arm gently, but with a grip that didn't ask permission. "Not here?" he said, his voice barely above a breath. "She has ears everywhere in this house." He didn't explain anything inside the house. Colin moved through the back hallway with the kind of quiet, deliberate confidence of a man who had mapped every inch of a space over years of silent observation. He led me through the utility room, past the old coat rack that still held a jacket I hadn't worn since before my retirement, and out through the rear service door, the one that opened to the side of the garden where the hedgerow grew thick and close to the wall. I followed him without a word. I'm not sure I was capable of words yet. The image of my son standing in the kitchen doorway upright, steady both feet on the floor, was still doing something to my understanding of the past 7 years that I couldn't quite name. Not disbelief exactly. Something closer to the particular vertigo of realizing that a map you've been navigating by for a long time doesn't match the actual terrain. The morning air hit me as we stepped outside, cool and damp, carrying that particular April smell of wet earth and new green. The kind that rolls off the river before the city wakes up enough to cover it. We moved along the stone path that runs behind the garden beds, staying close to the property wall, moving in the shadow of the old hedgerow, rather than across the open center of the lawn. I understood without being told that we were avoiding something. The rear camera mounted above the service door had stopped blinking its red indicator light sometime last year. I'd noticed it. I'd meant to ask the security company about it. Somehow I never had. Standing in the garden now, following my son along the wall, I found myself thinking about that camera with a different kind of attention. We reached the dock in less than 3 minutes. I hadn't stood on this dock in months. It ran about 30 feet out over the Cooper River from the back of the property, old pine boards darkened by years of weather. Built in 2014, back when Colin and I used to spend Sunday mornings out here with cheap coffee and fishing lines we never took seriously. We'd catch nothing mostly, talk about nothing in particular. The kind of morning that doesn't seem significant when you're in it and only reveals itself as significant later, when you're trying to locate the last time things were simply what they appeared to be. The iron cleats along the sides were orange with rust. The small aluminum canoe we'd kept tied to the far post had long since been put into storage the summer after Colin's accident, when certain things about our Sunday mornings changed permanently. Or so I had believed. The dock was still standing still solid underfoot, and this morning it smelled exactly the way it always had, like river water and timber and something older underneath. Something that had nothing to do with the house or the people in it. The river moved past below us with its own quiet indifference, and the far bank sat low and green across the water. Colin sat down on the far bench, set his laptop on his knees, and looked out at the water for a moment before he spoke. "She ran a check on the main camera system 2 weeks ago," he said, his voice low and even. "The dock isn't connected to the household network. She looked at the panel, saw it wasn't listed, and assumed there was nothing out here." He tilted his head slightly toward the piling at the water's edge, where a small black housing unit sat just above the waterline, half covered by the shadow of the board above it. "It runs on its own battery, its own signal. She has no idea it's there." I looked at the camera housing. Then I looked at my son sitting on the dock bench with a laptop on his knees, feet flat on the pine boards. The April light coming in across the water, and I thought about how long he must have been thinking about all of this. How many mornings he had sat at that breakfast table watching, filing things away. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. He didn't answer that. Not directly. Instead, he opened the laptop, angled the screen away from the river glare, and said, "Before I show you the files, you need to know the truth about the accident." I had told myself a version of that day so many times that it had become smooth and featureless, the way a stone becomes smooth when water runs over it long enough. All the irregular edges worn down. All the places where questions might have caught polished away. March 2017. A construction site in the North Charleston corridor. A scaffolding failure on the 4th floor. My son airlifted to MUSC Health with severe spinal trauma. An accident. That was the word used in every report, every insurance form, every conversation, with every doctor, every attorney, every well-meaning friend who had sat across from me and shaken their head. A terrible accident. The phrase had become so familiar, I had stopped hearing the individual words. It had become simply the name for what had happened, a closed container stored and labeled not requiring further examination. Colin looked at me across the laptop screen and said, "I was working for Meridian Build that year. Independent firm not connected to your company, not connected to anything you were running. You know that." "I know," I said. "You used to come by job sites. You'd drive out in the mornings when you had a project you wanted to see. I knew you were planning to visit that site that week you'd mentioned it at dinner, the Sunday before." He paused. The river filled the silence. "I had an early delivery scheduled, materials arriving at 6:30. I got there before you. I walked into the 4th floor section to check the grid layout before the crew arrived." His jaw tightened. The safety bolts on the outer platform had been removed, not loosened, removed. Someone had taken them out the night before and left the platform looking intact from a distance. The sound of the river filled the silence between us. "The platform gave way the moment I stepped onto it," he said. "If you had walked out there instead of me at your age with the height of that fall..." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I sat very still on the old pine bench and tried to understand the full weight of what he was telling me. Someone had gone to that site in the darkness of the night before and removed the bolts that held that platform in place. Not randomly, not carelessly, with specific knowledge of the structure and specific intent regarding who would be standing on it the following morning. Not Colin. Colin had arrived early, taken an unplanned route through the 4th floor, and stepped onto a platform prepared for someone else. My son had taken that fall in my place. He had spent 7 years in a wheelchair, 4 of them I was only now beginning to understand, no longer needing it, carrying the knowledge of what had actually happened every single day of those 7 years. While I sat at the breakfast table across from the person responsible and called it a normal morning. "Colin," my voice came out quieter than I intended. "How long have you known..." He looked at me steadily, not with anger, not with the kind of pain that needs immediate expression, with something quieter and more durable, the look of a man who has lived alongside a difficult truth long enough to carry it without being crushed by it. "I started putting it together about 4 years ago," he said. "Small things at first, then not so small." He glanced down at the laptop screen, then back up at me. "I have his name. I've had it for 4 years. He held my gaze and didn't look away. And I've known his name for 4 years. He turned the laptop to face me. There was a photograph on the screen, a professional headshot, the kind pulled from a corporate directory or a licensing board website. A man in his mid-40s, dark-haired, with a particular kind of smile that looks confident from a distance and calculating up close. Beneath the photo, a name. Dominic Shaw. I didn't need Colin to explain who he was. The name landed in my chest, the way a familiar sound does in a dark room. Immediate recognition, the body responding, before the mind catches up. I felt my jaw tighten without deciding to tighten it. I felt the particular stillness that comes when something you filed away a long time ago suddenly becomes relevant again in a way you didn't anticipate. "I know him," I said. "I know you do." Dominic Shaw had been a contract legal partner at Brennan Corp for 6 years before I let him go. He was sharp, genuinely sharp, the kind of legal mind that finds angles other people miss and exploits them with a precision that looks from the outside like simple competence. For a while, I'd considered bringing him on full-time. Then in late 2012, my internal finance director flagged a series of irregularities in vendor billing accounts that Shaw had oversight on. The audit took 3 weeks. The findings were unambiguous. He'd been routing fractional overcharges through subcontractor invoices for at least 2 years, small enough amounts that individual line reviews wouldn't catch them, large enough in aggregate to matter significantly. When I called him into my office and laid the documents on the desk between us, he didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He sat in the chair across from me, with his hands folded and his expression perfectly level. And he looked at the documents the way a chess player looks at a board when the game has already been decided. "You'll regret this," he said. Not a threat exactly. The tone was too quiet for that. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they've already decided what happens next, when they're informing you of a future that's already been planned, rather than warning you about one that might occur. I terminated his contract, reported the conduct to the state bar, and moved on. He lost his license to practice law within the year. I told myself that was the end of Dominic Shaw. I was wrong. After he lost his license, he retrained as an independent insurance broker, Colin said, his voice carrying the careful steadiness of someone who has rehearsed a difficult conversation many times in private. No law degree required, just a broker's license and a client list. He built a new practice from scratch. He paused. His specialty became high-value life and estate policies. I looked at the screen. Dominic's photo looked back at me with the same expression I remembered from that office, composed, watchful, the smile doing its work from the surface while something else operated underneath. "Natalie wasn't a coincidence," Colin continued. "She was a placement. He found her, trained her, and put her inside the company deliberately." He pulled up a second file, a scanned employment record. She applied for a position in the financial operations department in early 2015. The team was 50-plus employees. Department heads handled their own hiring at that level. It never came to you for a signature. I stared at the record. I remembered the name on the internal directory vaguely, the way you remember a face from a company event present without being notable, present without being examined. She spent 2 years inside Brennan Corp learning the asset structure, Colin said. The estate value, the investment accounts, the property holdings, everything. His jaw tightened. Then she came to the Charleston Building and Design Expo in October 2017, the one you asked me to attend on your behalf, because you had the Meridian briefing that afternoon. We spoke for 12 minutes at the networking reception. She was warm, funny. She asked the right questions. He looked out at the river for a moment. I thought it was luck. The morning light on the water was bright and flat now. The last of the early mist burned off by the time the sun cleared the tree line. Somewhere downriver, a boat engine turned over and settled into idle. The sound drifted across to us and faded into the ordinary noise of the city waking up on the far side of the water. She quit Brennan Corp the month we got engaged, Colin said. February 2018. Before he showed me the next file, Colin asked me something I hadn't expected. Dad, do you remember when you started forgetting things? The exact month it began. I thought about it carefully, the way you do when someone asks you to locate a memory that you realize with some discomfort has been sitting just out of reach for a long time. Not lost, just never properly examined. Early 2019, I said slowly. Around February, March. He nodded. He told me about Richard Holt. Natalie had mentioned her first husband to me once early in her marriage to Colin, a businessman from Savannah, Georgia, who had passed away suddenly the year before they met. A cardiac event, she'd said, completely without warning. She'd described it with the kind of quiet, controlled sadness that made me feel that pressing for details would be unkind, that asking questions would be a failure of consideration. I had offered my condolences and never raised the subject again. I understood now that this was exactly what she had intended. She received $800,000 from his life insurance policy, Colin said. Dominic Shaw processed the claim. He was her broker on the policy. He let that sit for a moment. The attending physician who signed the paperwork listed it as a natural cardiac event. I have the name of that physician. It isn't a name I recognize from any legitimate practice in Savannah. I looked at the river and said nothing. She was with us within a year of Richard Holt's passing, Colin continued. Within 18 months of a policy worth more than $3 million being taken out on this estate. He reached into the front pocket of the laptop case and placed a small orange prescription bottle on the bench between us. I recognized it immediately. It was mine, or it had been sitting in my medicine cabinet beside the blue label bottle I'd been taking for blood pressure management since 2018. I'd seen it on that shelf hundreds of mornings without examining it closely. It was simply part of the routine. Part of what I accepted without question, because questioning it had never seemed necessary. "These are not your blood pressure pills," Colin said quietly. I picked up the bottle and turned it over in my hands. The label looked correct. The pharmacy name, the dosage instructions, my name printed across the top in the standard font. Everything in its expected place. But the weight was wrong. Too light. And when I shook it, the sound the tablets made against the plastic wasn't the sound I'd been hearing for years. A slightly different register, a slightly different density. I had reached for this bottle every morning for months without noticing. I had 2 tablets tested independently 8 months ago, he said. Benzodiazepine compound, low concentration but consistent, taken daily over time. He stopped. It doesn't take much to make a person doubt what they're seeing, doubt what they're feeling, doubt their own mind. I sat with the bottle in my hand and thought about every morning I'd shaken a pill into my palm without looking at it closely. Every afternoon I'd felt the particular heaviness settle in behind my eyes and told myself I was tired, I was grieving, I was getting old. Every thought I'd almost followed to its conclusion and let dissolve before it arrived anywhere. Every instinct I had dismissed as unreliable. "And she's been doing this for 5 years, Dad," Colin said. "And that's just the beginning of what I need to show you." Colin didn't say anything at first. He reached into the back sleeve of the laptop case and pulled out a folded manila envelope, the kind used for legal documents thick and creased from being handled many times. He set it on the bench between us, opened the flap, and began laying papers out across the flat surface of the dock, railing one by one, smoothing each sheet with the back of his hand before moving to the next. I watched him do it and said nothing. There were 11 documents in total. Some were single pages, some ran to 3 or 4. They were organized in the order he'd placed them, and I understood looking at the sequence that the order was deliberate. He'd arranged them to be read the way a closing argument is arranged, each piece building on the one before it, each page making the next one harder to dismiss. He had not assembled this envelope quickly. He had assembled it the way a person assembles something they intend to be irrefutable. At the bottom right corner of every single document was a signature. Mine. I am 69 years old. I ran a construction development company for the better part of 4 decades. I have signed more documents than I could ever count. Contracts, permits, acquisition agreements, liability waivers, letters of intent. My signature is as familiar to me as my own reflection. I know the exact pressure I put on the pen, the way the W loops wide on good days and tighter when I'm tired. The way the B runs slightly lower than the baseline when my hand has been working for a while. Every signature on those 11 pages was mine. I did not remember signing a single one of them. I sat with that fact for a moment before I let myself move to the next one. Not because I doubted what I was looking at. The signatures were unmistakably mine, down to the tired day variations in the letter forms, but because the full meaning of it required a second to settle. I had not been robbed in the night. I had been walked carefully and repeatedly through the process of dismantling my own estate while believing I was simply finishing my evening tea. The first 3 were financial authorization forms, documents granting limited power of attorney over specific accounts within my estate portfolio, the kind of instrument that, in the right hands, allows a designated agent to execute transactions, approve transfers, and redirect funds without requiring my direct sign-off on each individual action. Standard enough in estate planning when drawn up correctly with proper disclosure and a clear paper trail of intent. These had not been drawn up correctly. The dates on the authorizations ran from March through August of 2019. I looked at the calendar of that period in my mind and tried to locate those specific evenings, tried to find the memory of sitting at a table, reading a document, deciding to sign. What I found instead was the recurring image of the back sitting room after dinner, the low lamp on the side table, the herbal tea Natalie always brought in around 8 o'clock. The way the room would begin to soften at the edges about 40 minutes later. I had thought I was relaxing. I had thought I was finally getting good rest after years of poor sleep. I had been grateful for it. Colin pointed to the fourth document without touching it. This one transfers a 15% interest in the secondary property holdings to a holding company registered in Delaware, he said. The company has 2 directors. One is a name I don't recognize. The other is a registered agent tied to a brokerage entity that Dominic Shaw has controlled since 2014. I picked up the page, read it, set it down. And I signed this, I said. On a Tuesday evening in June 2019, Colin said. I looked it up. It was the same week you told me you'd been sleeping 12 hours a night and still waking up tired. I remembered that week. I remembered telling him that. I remembered thinking that the fatigue was finally catching up with me, the accumulated weight of the years since his accident, the grief that never fully resolved itself, the particular exhaustion of a man who had been running on something other than rest for too long. I had been almost relieved to have an explanation for it. He let me work through the remaining documents at my own pace. By the time I reached the last one, the one he'd placed face down at the end of the row, I had a reasonably clear picture of what the preceding pages represented. Taken individually, none of them would have raised a red flag in isolation. A financial authorization here, a management agreement there, the kind of incremental paperwork that accumulates around a large estate over time and that most people don't scrutinize closely because there seems to be no reason to, because the person placing it in front of you has already been trusted with everything else. Taken together, they formed a structure, a quiet, methodical reordering of the relationships between Walter Brennan and his own assets, one signature at a time, across a period when Walter Brennan had not been entirely Walter Brennan. I turned over the last document. It was a life insurance policy application. Standard format, 4 pages issued through a mid-sized underwriting firm. I didn't recognize Hargrove Meridian Life, an estate headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. The policyholder name was Walter James Brennan. The coverage amount was listed in the summary box on the first page, printed in the clean, neutral font that insurance documents use regardless of what they're actually saying. $3 million. The beneficiary line read Natalie Ann Brennan's spouse. The date of signature was March 14, 2020. I remembered that week, not the signing. I didn't remember that. But I remembered the week itself, with unusual clarity, the way you sometimes remember the frame of an event, even when the center of it has gone. I'd had what I thought was a mild flu. 3 days of fatigue, low-grade fever, difficulty concentrating on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. I'd stayed home, slept a great deal, and by the weekend felt well enough to sit in the garden for an hour in the afternoon sun. Natalie had been attentive throughout, bringing meals on a tray, managing my medications, appearing at regular intervals with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of someone who understood exactly what was needed and when. I had been grateful for her then. I had thought not for the first time that Colin had chosen well. I looked at the date on the document again. March 14th, 2020. Hargrove Meridian, I said. I've never heard of them. They've been operating for 9 years, Colin said. Legitimate enough on the surface, licensed, registered, active policy portfolio. But the original capitalization came through a chain of holding entities. One of those entities connects directly to a brokerage account in Dominic Shaw's name. He paused. He didn't just process the policy, Dad. He built the company that issued it. $3 million. I set the document down on the railing and looked at the water. The Cooper moved past below us, the way it always did, without comment, without adjustment, entirely unchanged by what was happening on the dock above it. I had always found the river reliable in that way. This morning, the reliability felt less comforting than usual. My hands were steady. I had spent 40 years in boardrooms making decisions that other men found difficult, and I had learned early that the moment your hands start moving is the moment you lose the room. Steadiness had been a professional discipline for so long that it had become simply how I was built. But for 1 second, one single second, I felt the page tremble slightly between my fingers before I placed it flat on the rail. I let that second pass. I breathed once. I set the document down. I looked at my son across the spread of papers on the railing. 11 documents, 11 signatures. The systematic architecture of something that had been built around me while I stood inside it and called it home. Then I looked at my son. "There's one more file," Colin said quietly, "about who Natalie was before she ever walked through our door." The folder was simply labeled with a name and a year. R. Holt 2016. Colin opened it without commentary, and the screen filled with the kind of documents that carry a particular weight, not because of their legal language, but because of what they represent. An obituary printed from a Savannah newspaper, a funeral program, the cover showing a photograph of a man standing outdoors, somewhere smiling, broadly squinting, slightly against the sun. A policy summary sheet with a beneficiary line I'd already learned to look for. I leaned forward and looked at the photograph. Richard Holt had been 52 years old when he passed. He had the kind of face that suggested someone who laughed easily, broad features, the smile pulling wide, and unguarded the posture of a person comfortable in their own body. A businessman, the obituary said. Commercial real estate primarily in the greater Savannah area. Survived by his wife Natalie. No children. Services held at First Presbyterian Interment Private. The cause listed on the death record was a sudden cardiac event. No prior diagnosis. No warning signs documented. Dominic processed the claim, Colin said. The brokerage firm on the policy documentation was a smaller entity. He operated in Georgia, different name than Hargrove Meridian, same structural template. The payout was $800,000 transferred to Natalie within 60 days of the death record being filed. He paused. The paperwork was clean. No irregularities flagged by the insurer. No review requested. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. She practiced on him, I said. The words came out flat without inflection. I wasn't editorializing. I was simply saying what the documents taken together appeared to indicate. Colin didn't confirm or deny it directly. He just held my gaze long enough to tell me he'd arrived at the same conclusion. We were never the first, I said. We were just the largest. Yes, he said. I sat back on the bench and looked at the river. We had been out on this dock for nearly an hour. The April morning had settled into its full light, now the sky a pale, clean blue above the far bank of the Cooper. A heron stood motionless at the waterline 20 yards downstream, absolutely still, waiting for something beneath the surface. When did you start getting better? I asked. And why didn't you tell me? Colin was quiet for a moment. He closed the laptop halfway and set it to one side. The first sign was in January 2020, he said. I woke up one morning and felt something in my left foot. A twitch, barely anything. The kind of sensation you might convince yourself was imaginary. He looked at his hands. I didn't tell you because I didn't know what it meant yet, and because by that point I had already begun to understand that something in that house wasn't right. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I showed anyone a card. You were protecting yourself, I said. I was protecting both of us, he said. If Natalie knew I was recovering, she would have adjusted whatever she was doing, and I would have lost whatever window I had to see the full picture. I understood that. As a strategic decision, it was sound. As a human one, as a father, absorbing the image of his son alone and in pain, making that calculation in silence, it was something I would need more time to sit with. He told me about the nights. After the household went quiet, after Natalie's light went off and the house settled into its late-night stillness, Colin would lower himself from the bed to the floor of his room. The floorboards in that room were old pine cool under his hands, smooth from decades of foot traffic. He'd work on the exercises in complete darkness. No lamp, no phone screen, nothing that might throw light under the door or cast a shadow visible from the hallway. In the beginning, it was only sensation trying to locate the connections between intention and movement to relearn what his nervous system had partially redrawn after the injury. It was slow. It was painful in the way that deep physical work always is the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles into the joints and stays. He told me about the cold and the silence and the particular discipline it requires to want something as badly as he wanted it, and not allow any sign of it to surface during the daylight hours. To be lifted into a wheelchair every morning and let someone position his legs and wheel him to the breakfast table while his body already knew things that his expression could not show. Natalie believed the medication she'd arranged through Dr. Harmon was maintaining my condition, he said quietly. She wasn't monitoring me for recovery. She was monitoring for stability, making sure I stayed exactly where I was. His voice was measured, but something moved beneath the surface of it. So, as long as I gave her stability, she had no reason to look more closely. 4 years. Every night in the dark, rebuilding what the fall had taken, while the woman who had helped arrange that fall moved through the house above him planning. In the summer of 2020, on a night he described as warm and airless, Colin pressed his palms to the floor and pushed himself upright. He stood shaking from the effort, his entire body registering the act with a kind of pain. He said he couldn't fully put into language for approximately 3 seconds before his knees gave and he went back down to the floor. He said he pressed his forehead against the cool wood and stayed there for a long time. He said he didn't make a sound. The night I stood up for the first time, Colin said, his voice dropping just slightly, I heard her voice downstairs. He looked at me steadily. And what she said changed everything. If you're still here, comment, still watching. So I know you're with me. And tell me this, if you were in my place holding all these pieces but not the final proof yet, would you confront them immediately or stay quiet and wait for the moment everything is undeniable? Also, just a quick note, the next part of this story includes some fictional elements added for storytelling purposes. If you'd rather not continue, you're free to stop here. He told me about that night, every detail of it, quiet and exact. The way a person recounts something they have gone over so many times in their own mind that the edges have become perfectly clear. It was summer 2020. The house was warm and still the kind of airless heat that settles into old buildings late at night when the coastal breeze has died and the walls have absorbed a full day of sun. Colin had been lying on the floor of his room. He'd just managed those 3 seconds of standing, just come back down to the cool pine boards when he heard it. A voice downstairs. Low and careful, the particular kind of quiet that isn't silence but is trying to be. He told me he pulled himself to the doorway and into the hallway without a sound, moving on his forearms across the floor, stopping at the top of the landing where the iron rail ran along the edge of the upper hall. From there, he could look down into the front corridor and hear, without being seen, the faint light of a phone screen coming from the kitchen doorway. He stayed there for 11 minutes. What he heard pressed against the rail in the dark at 2 a.m. was a woman's voice he had shared a home with for 3 years. "The old man is getting easier to manage," Natalie said. Her tone was even, unhurried, the voice of someone giving a routine status update. "The son is no problem. He can't go anywhere." A pause. A man's voice from the other end, too low for Colin to catch the words, but the cadence was measured, deliberate. "Exactly," she said. "Then we stay the course." The kitchen light went out. He heard her footsteps move toward the back of the house and up the secondary staircase. He stayed on the hallway floor until he was certain she was in her room. Then he pulled himself back to his own. He told me he lay in the dark for the remainder of that night without sleeping. He told me what he decided and what he decided against. The most obvious move was to call the police. He understood that, and he also understood why it wasn't an option, at least not at the local level. Dominic Shaw had practiced law in Charleston for 6 years. He had relationships in the city's legal and civic structure that didn't disappear when his license was revoked, connections built over years in rooms where decisions get made quietly. Bringing a local report to a department where Dominic had acquaintances and former colleagues meant the information would not stay contained. The only structure with the independence and jurisdiction to act without those entanglements was federal. So, Colin did not make a call. He made a plan. Within the week, he had sourced 2 small audio recording devices, compact enough to sit inside everyday objects without detection. One went into the casing of the clock on his bedroom wall. The second went inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf beside his door. The laptop he'd been using was already concealed in the cavity beneath his bedside cabinet, accessible only from the floor level. Positioned so that his wheelchair, parked in its usual place beside the bed, blocked the lower panel from casual view. He purchased 2 prepaid SIM cards with cash from separate locations, one for communications, one for uploading encrypted file backups to a private remote server that no device inside the house had the address for. He told me all of this from a wheelchair he hadn't needed in 4 years. "That was 3.5 years ago," he said. "I've been recording ever since." There was one more thing he told me before he reached for the laptop again. Starting in early 2021, once he had a clearer understanding of what was in my medication, Colin began making careful substitutions, not wholesale replacements. Natalie conducted periodic checks on the pill bottles, verifying fill levels against what she expected to be consumed. A complete swap would have been noticed immediately. Instead, he worked in partial exchanges, removing several of the altered tablets and replacing them with pharmacy-grade equivalents purchased during the brief windows when he was transported to medical appointments and left briefly unattended. "I couldn't eliminate it entirely," he said, "but I could reduce the concentration significantly." He paused. "That's why you still have full cognitive function, Dad. That's why the damage didn't go further than it did." I absorbed that without speaking. My son had been lying on a cold floor in the dark rebuilding, the use of his legs secretly correcting my medication, and building a federal-grade evidence file simultaneously for years. While I sat across the breakfast table from the person responsible taking pills she handed me and told myself my mind was just getting old. Then he opened the audio file. I had not been conscious for the event itself. I remembered the winter of 2021, the way I remembered most of that period in fragments through gauze. I remembered the staircase. I remembered the particular sensation of reaching for the wall and finding nothing, the half-second of understanding before the fall. And then the ceiling of MUS, Sea Health's emergency intake, and someone asking me to follow a light with my eyes. 2 fractured ribs, mild cranial trauma, 3 days admitted. Natalie had been at my bedside for every one of them. The audio file Colin played me was 47 seconds long. It had been recorded the evening of my admission. The timestamp in the file metadata put it at 11:20 p.m. from the device concealed in the hallway clock 2 rooms away from the phone call. I recognized her voice immediately. "He fell. It's done." A pause. "Harmon will handle the rest." That was it. Clean, efficient, and delivered with the same tone she used when confirming a grocery order had been placed. The recording ended. The silence that followed it was very complete. I looked at the water. A minute passed. "Oh, Harmon," I said. I heard the name come out of my mouth and recognized it the way you recognize something you should have questioned a long time ago. "Who is Harmon?" Colin took a breath before he answered. Not the breath of someone stalling, the breath of someone who has been carrying a particular piece of information for a long time and is making a deliberate choice about how to set it down carefully, without it breaking something in the process. "His full name is Gerald Harmon," Colin said. "He's been on staff at MUSC Health for 11 years, cardiology and internal medicine primarily. By most standard measures, a competent physician, solid patient, reviews no disciplinary history. Nothing in his public record that would draw a second look from anyone doing a routine background check." He paused. "Dominic approached him sometime before your hospitalization. We don't have the exact date of first contact, but the communications we've recovered suggest the arrangement was already in place well before your fall on those stairs." I turned that over carefully in my mind. Before your fall, not after. Before meaning the hospitalization wasn't an unexpected complication that required quick improvisation. It was a window that had been prepared for. The staircase, the wet floor, the hallway light that had stopped working the week prior and never been repaired. Despite my asking twice, none of it had been careless. It had been deliberate preparation for a specific outcome. "What kind of arrangement?" I asked, though I already had a reasonable sense of the answer. "When Harmon agreed to conduct a formal cognitive evaluation during your admission," Colin said. "It was presented to you as a standard neurological screening routine protocol after any head trauma, the kind of thing hospitals include in standard discharge paperwork. You signed the consent form the second morning of your stay." I remembered it. Or, I remembered the outline of it, a form on a clipboard, a younger nurse explaining in a pleasant, unhurried voice that it was entirely standard procedure following any impact to the head. My signature going at the bottom without my glasses on and the overhead fluorescence giving me a headache. 3 days into that hospital, stay still managing 2 fractured ribs, and the particular fog that follows a concussion still operating at significantly less than full capacity. It had seemed entirely unremarkable. It had seemed like paperwork. The evaluation was designed to reach a specific conclusion before it was ever administered, Colin said. He opened the audio file without preamble. The recording was short, a corridor exchange, the ambient sound of a hospital at night underneath it, the distant movement of equipment and soft-soled shoes on linoleum. 2 voices speaking in the careful, measured murmur of people who are aware they're in a semi-public space and are choosing their words accordingly. Natalie's voice came through, first calm, unhurried, the tone she used for logistics. "The evaluation needs to show early-stage cognitive decline, enough for guardianship." A pause. A man's voice low and precise, with the clipped delivery of someone accustomed to medical documentation. "What's the timeline?" Her response, "When he's discharged, within the month." The file ended at 41 seconds. Colin let the silence sit before he continued. The objective was to establish a documented legal record of cognitive impairment sufficient to file a petition for guardianship with the county probate court. Once that determination existed on paper and had been signed off by a licensed attending physician, she could have initiated the formal transfer of estate management authority. The process under South Carolina law takes between 60 and 90 days from filing to approval when there's no medical challenge. I absorbed that. And I wouldn't have been considered capable of challenging it, I said, because the record would have shown I wasn't capable of making that determination. Correct, Colin said. I had built a company from the ground up over 4 decades. I had sat across negotiating tables from men who were trying to take things from me, and I had held my position every single time. And in the space of one hospitalization, one carefully arranged fall on a staircase made wet the evening before, one hallway light that had been left burned out for just long enough, I had come within a single counter-signature of losing the legal standing to be considered a competent adult in my own home. It didn't go through, I said, because I pulled the form before it reached the attending physician for counter-signature, Colin said. It disappeared from your discharge packet during shift change. Doctor, Harmon logged the evaluation as incomplete, citing patient fatigue as the cause for the abbreviated session. A pause. Natalie was not pleased. I have that conversation on audio as well, if you'd like to hear it. Not right now, I said. I looked out at the Cooper River and let myself sit with what I had just learned. Not processing it fully, there wasn't time for that. And I wasn't sure my system could absorb it all at once, but marking it, setting it in place. Understanding that every moment of confusion I had experienced over the past several years, every morning I had doubted my own recall. Every time I had let a half-formed thought go because I no longer trusted the mind producing it, all of it had been by design. My son had intercepted a legal document from a hospital discharge file from a wheelchair without being detected. "You've been very busy," I said quietly. He looked at me with something I couldn't quite read, not pride, not satisfaction. Something closer to relief, I thought, the relief of a person who has been holding something alone for a very long time and has finally been able to put it in front of someone else. "Yes," he said, "but I haven't been doing it alone, not for the last 2 years. He told me about James. James Whitfield and Colin had been close friends since their freshman year at the University of South Carolina. The particular kind of friendship that forms in the first weeks of college. Built in dormitory hallways and over bad dining hall coffee, the kind that survives graduation and distance, and the diverging paths that adult life creates between people. After finishing his degree, James had gone into federal law enforcement. He had worked his way into the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, a specialized division that investigates complex multi-state fraud operations, insurance manipulation schemes, and the kind of sustained financial predation that leaves a carefully constructed paper trail across multiple jurisdictions and multiple victims. 2 years ago, Colin had opened an anonymous email account on a prepaid device purchased with cash. The first message he sent contained no names, no addresses, no property details. Just a structured outline, a long-running insurance and estate fraud operation, professional orchestration. Documented evidence of prior incidents involving at least one confirmed fatality, and an active ongoing scheme currently in its final phase. James had called the designated prepaid number within 48 hours. "We've been building the case in parallel ever since," Colin said. He approached it from the outside, pulling financial records tracing Dominic's brokerage history across multiple states, mapping the Hargrove Meridian paper trail back to its original source, obtaining the documentation on the Richard Holt policy in Savannah. He set the laptop to one side and looked at me directly. I built it from the inside. Every recording, every document, every time stamp. His file and mine cross-reference completely. There are no gaps between them. "The warrant," I said. "Signed by a federal judge 14 days ago, Colin said. "It covers both Natalie and Dominic conspiracy to commit financial fraud, documented elder financial abuse evidence strongly suggesting involvement in a prior unexplained fatality, and conspiracy to obtain estate assets through fraudulent legal instruments." His voice stayed level and precise, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this summary many times. "The warrant activates the moment we transmit the signal to James." I sat with that for a moment. This morning, the morning Natalie had set my medication on the counter with 2 fingers and reminded me she'd returned from Scottsdale. On Sunday, a federal team had already been positioned less than 10 minutes from this property since the previous evening. They had been there while I made my coffee. while I watched her car reverse down the driveway, while I stood in my own kitchen and tried to hold on to a thought that kept slipping away. "James confirmed this morning," Colin said. Before she left, the message came through. "His team is in position and has been since last night." He paused. "He said he's been ready for a while. He's just been waiting for us to make the call." I looked at my son for a long moment without speaking. The river moved past us with the same indifference it had always shown, unhurried, unchanged, entirely unaware of what was happening on the dock above it. A pair of egrets had settled somewhere downstream, their shapes barely visible through the morning haze. The sun was fully up now, the April light gone from gold to white. And somewhere in the distance, the city was beginning its day without any knowledge of the conversation that had been happening out here on these old pine boards. "I need to tell you something I did." Colin looked at me. He didn't say anything. He waited. It was the spring of 2022. I remember it as one of those rare stretches, maybe 3 or 4 days in close succession, when the fog lifted enough that I could think in straight lines again. I didn't know then what was causing it to lift. I suspect now that it coincided with a period when Colin had managed to reduce the dosage in my medication more significantly than usual. Though we've never mapped it precisely against his substitution records, whatever the reason, I had 4 days in which I felt something approaching myself. I used them carefully. On the second afternoon, I went into the private library on the east side of the house, a room Natalie rarely entered because she found it, as she once put it, oppressively quiet. I sat at the old writing desk my father had left me, and I composed a handwritten will, not a revision of the existing document my attorneys held on file, a separate instrument written by hand with specific language around the estate assets, the property holdings, and the disposition of the accounts that had been quietly restructured over the preceding 3 years. I wrote it as clearly as I knew how in the steadiest hand I could manage, and I signed and dated it at the bottom. Then I folded it, sealed it in a plain envelope, and placed it in the small fireproof safe I'd had installed behind the false panel at the back of the built-in bookcase when the library was renovated in 2009. The safe that had never appeared on any household inventory, the one whose combination Natalie had never been given. I wasn't certain the document would hold up legally in every particular, but I was certain that if anything happened to me, it would exist, and that its existence alongside everything else would complicate any clean transfer of assets considerably. Before I left the library that afternoon, I took a book from the third shelf, a worn copy of a novel I'd read aloud to Colin over several winters when he was young. The spine cracked from use, and the cover faded to a pale version of its original color. I slipped a small folded note between pages 42 and 43. The note contained 12 characters that would mean nothing to most people. To Colin, who had grown up watching me build simple cipher systems for company communications, it would mean exactly one thing. I put the book back on the shelf and left the library. "I know about the safe," Colin said quietly. I looked at him. "I found the note 2 years ago," he said. "I went into the library one afternoon when Natalie was running errands. I told her I wanted to sit in there for a while. She didn't question it." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "I recognized the format immediately. Opened the panel that same afternoon." He paused. "The will is intact. I photographed every page and included the images in the package I sent James. It's part of the federal documentation." I held that for a moment. The image of my son 2 years ago, lowering himself from a wheelchair he didn't need, and opening a safe behind a false panel in a quiet room. Finding the letter I'd left him without knowing I was leaving it for him specifically. We looked at each other across the bench in the early morning light, and neither of us said anything for a few seconds. There was something in the silence that didn't require words, a recognition that ran underneath language, the particular understanding between two people who have been trying to protect each other from opposite sides of the same wall for years, without knowing it. Then Colin's phone vibrated against the bench. He picked it up in the same motion, smooth practiced the movement of someone who had been monitoring an alert system for long enough that the response had become automatic. He looked at the screen. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it sharpened. He turned the phone toward me. The camera feed from the front gate showed a black SUV pulled to the curb on the far side of the iron fence. Full size, no front plate visible. Engine still running, I could see the faint heat shimmer from the exhaust in the morning air. The timestamp in the corner of the frame read 9:47 a.m. A man stepped out at the driver's side door. Even on the small screen at the angle and distance the gate camera was working with, I knew the posture. The particular set of shoulders, the deliberate way the feet found the ground, the physical language of someone who had once sat across a desk from me and told me without raising his voice that I would regret a decision I'd made. Dominic Shaw stood at the gate of my property and looked at the front of the house. He checked his watch. He looked at the house again. "He's not supposed to be here," Colin said. His voice was completely level. "Not until tonight. This isn't part of the plan Natalie laid out. He decided this on his own." "Why would he move early?" I asked. "Because he's cautious," Colin said, his eyes still on the screen. "He doesn't trust timelines he doesn't control. He wants to walk the property before dark, confirm the layout, confirm the access points." He paused. "He knows the inside of the house. He doesn't know about this dock. The dock wasn't here when he was still connected to this property. He has no reason to know it exists." On the screen, Dominic took one more look at the house, then got back into the SUV. The vehicle didn't pull away. It simply idled at the curb, waiting. "Natalie is on a plane to Scottsdale right now." Colin said, his eyes still on the camera feed. "She doesn't know he moved the timeline up." He set the phone down between us and looked at me. "She must not know he moved early, which means we still have time." Colin didn't look at me when he reached for the laptop. He opened it with the same deliberate calm he'd maintained since we'd sat down out here, the particular steadiness of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment for long enough that the moment itself, when it arrives, feels less like a crisis and more like the last step of a long walk. He navigated to the final folder in the file structure and turned the screen toward me. "This is what she prepared for you before she left," he said. The folder was labeled with a date, late March 2024, less than 3 weeks ago. The first document was a medical assessment form, 4 pages, issued on MUSC Health letterhead and signed at the bottom by Gerald Harmon, MD. The language was clinical and precise, the kind of careful neutral phrasing that medical documentation uses to describe devastating things without appearing to take a position on them. It described a patient, Walter James Brennan, DSOB, listed correctly. Age 69, is presenting with advanced and progressive cognitive deterioration, consistent with early to moderate stage impairment, with documented decline across multiple assessment categories over a period of 18 months. It recommended immediate review of the patient's capacity to manage his own financial and legal affairs. It was in every visible particular a professional medical document. It was also, Colin explained, fabricated in its entirety. Gerald Harmon had signed a form describing a patient condition that did not exist based on evaluations that had not been conducted. "This is the document she planned to file with probate court while she was in Scottsdale," Colin said, "establishing your incapacity as a matter of formal medical record. From that point, the guardianship petition would have been a procedural matter, 60 to 90 days, no contest possible from you, no challenge to her authority over the estate." I read the document twice. My name, my date of birth, my address, everything accurate except the content of every finding it contained. "And the medication," I said. "The medication was the other half of it," he said. He told me about what had been in the orange prescription bottle that had been sitting in my bedside drawer for the past 3 weeks. Not the blood pressure compound, not the benzodiazepine blend that had been clouding my thinking for 5 years. Something different, a specific formulation sourced through a channel that ran back through doctor. Harmon designed to produce cardiovascular stress that would register in a clinical post-incident examination as consistent with a natural cardiac failure. The kind of event that, in a 69-year-old man with a documented history of health concerns, would not prompt an extended inquiry. The kind of event that would look to anyone reviewing the file exactly like what had happened to Richard Holt in Savannah 8 years ago. The plan as Colin laid it out was clean in its simplicity. Natalie in Scottsdale, verifiable location, hotel check-in, restaurant, receipts, the kind of alibi that photographs itself. Walter alone in the house. A medication he'd been taking voluntarily for weeks, adjusted to a lethal concentration in the final days before her departure. A medical file on record declaring him cognitively impaired, and Dominic Shaw already positioned and ready to manage the insurance claim the same way he had managed the one in Savannah. $3 million. Clean paperwork, a grieving widow in Arizona with a time-stamped alibi. I sat with that for a moment. Last night, Colin said, after the house went quiet, I went to your room. He told me what he'd found. The bottle in my nightstand drawer, the one I'd been taking for the past 3 weeks, the one Natalie had placed there herself before organizing this trip. He'd recognized it wasn't right. The weight, the sound, the slight variation in tablet color under his phone's flashlight that he'd trained himself over 4 years to detect. He'd taken the bottle, replaced it with a pharmacy-correct version he'd been holding for exactly this contingency, and sent a single encrypted message to the prepaid number James monitored. That message was why James and his team had been parked 10 minutes from this property since 11 o'clock the previous evening. How many did you take this morning, Dad? The question landed differently than questions usually do. I found myself going back over the morning with a precision I hadn't applied at the time. Standing in the kitchen, the routine of it reaching for the drawer out of habit. "1," I said, from the bottle in the drawer. "That's the replacement bottle," Colin said. "The one I put there last night. 1 dose from the correct formulation is manageable. It won't cause any harm." He paused. "But we are not going back into that house." I looked at my hands for a moment. Then I placed my right palm flat on the dock railing, pressed it there until the wood grain was solid and real under my skin, and looked at my son. "Tell me what to do next," I said. He picked up the prepaid phone from beside the laptop. He dialed without looking up the number. It rang twice. "James." His voice was steady and quiet. "It's time." The response came immediately, no hesitation, no request for clarification. "Send everything. I've been ready." Colin ended the call and opened the encrypted transfer application on the laptop. 3 separate server addresses each, in a different jurisdiction, each requiring its own authentication. He'd explained this architecture to me briefly in the first hour out here, redundancy by design, so that no single failure point could compromise the full package. Insurance records, audio files, document photographs, the will, the medication analysis. Dr. Harmon's fabricated assessment, alongside the real one Colin had obtained independently. 41 months of continuous evidence gathering, organized and cross-referenced, beginning its final journey to the people who had the authority and the jurisdiction to act on it. The upload progress bar moved steadily in the upper corner of the screen. I watched it and said nothing. Then the phone on the bench beside me buzzed once the live camera feed from the dock's own independent unit, the one Natalie had never known existed. I turned the screen over. The side gate of the property. The narrow service entrance on the east wall partially obscured by the old magnolia that had grown up against the iron fence over the decades. On the screen, a figure moved along the exterior wall with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who has studied a layout in advance and knows exactly which entrance draws the least attention. Dominic Shaw reached for the gate latch and tested it slowly. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't checking over his shoulder. He moved like a man who believed he already knew everything there was to know about what was waiting inside. He didn't know about the dock. A quick heads up before we go on some details in the next part have been shaped with fictional elements for narrative purposes. If you're not comfortable with that, you can stop here, but if you are, what comes next might change how you see everything. The laptop screen had split into 2 panels. On the left, the 3 upload progress bars read. The color Colin had set for active transfer moved in slow, steady increments. On the right, the live feed from the interior camera system Colin had built out over the past 4 years, 4 angles covering the main hallway, the staircase landing the east corridor, and the upstairs hall outside the bedroom doors. The feed was silent except for the faint digital timestamp ticking in the corner. I watched a man walk through my house. There is something profoundly disorienting about observing your own home from the outside, about watching the rooms you have lived in for years reduced to gray-toned rectangles on a screen, while a stranger moves through them with the ease of someone who has studied the floor plan in advance. Dominic Shaw moved through the ground floor of my house without hesitation. No searching, no opening drawers, no examination of surfaces. He wasn't there to take anything. He was there to confirm. He walked the perimeter of the sitting room, crossed through the dining area, stood briefly at the entrance to the kitchen, and looked in without entering. His movements were efficient and unhurried, the movements of a man running through a pre-departure checklist, verifying that each item is in its expected position before the larger plan proceeds. He didn't appear concerned. That I found was the most unsettling thing about watching him. "He's been in this house before," I said quietly. "Yes," Colin said without looking up from the upload panel. "More than once, I think, while you were at appointments." I watched the camera feed and didn't respond to that. Dominic moved to the staircase and went up. The upper hallway camera picked him up as he reached the landing, moving at the same measured pace, one hand trailing briefly along the wall before he straightened and continued toward the bedroom wing. He passed the door to my room without stopping. He paused briefly at the entrance to the guest room. Then he reached Colin's door and pushed it open. He stood in the doorway for what the timestamp indicated was approximately 20 seconds. The room was exactly as Colin had left it. Bed made, curtains open, the desk with its small lamp, and the books arranged along the back edge. And beside the desk, positioned precisely where it had been every morning for 4 years, the wheelchair. Empty upright, sitting in the particular way that objects do when they have become so associated with a person's daily presence that their absence from the space registers as wrongness. Dominic looked at the wheelchair. I watched him look at it. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes, it produced a specific result. He reached for his phone. Colin had the audio feed active on the prepaid device, a direct line into the same microphone system, embedded in the hallway clock, still operational, still transmitting. The call connected on the first ring. "They're not here." Dominic's voice was even, reporting a fact. A pause. Then Natalie's voice, and I heard immediately what I had never heard in 6 years of living under the same roof as this woman. The surface was still controlled. The words were still precise. But underneath the precision, something had shifted by a fraction of a degree. The particular quality of a voice when the situation it has been managing begins to move outside the parameters it was designed for. "What do you mean not there?" "Neither of them. House is empty." "Check every room." "The study." "The back sitting room." "I've been through the full ground floor and the upper hall," he said. "The old man's room is undisturbed. The son's room wheelchair is still there. They didn't take the car. Both vehicles are in the garage." A longer pause this time. "Let's find them. They can't have gone far. The old man can barely walk." The audio continued, Dominic confirming he would check the remaining rooms, Natalie repeating the instruction with a controlled urgency that I recognized belatedly, as the closest she was capable of coming to panic. But I had stopped processing the words at that specific sentence. The old man can barely walk. Colin turned his head and looked at me. I was 69 years old. I had run a company for 4 decades. I had built the house they were standing in. I had raised the man sitting next to me, and I had, without knowing it, spent 5 years being systematically reduced in the minds of the people who intended to profit from my absence, to an obstacle that could barely move under its own power. I looked at the camera feed and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. At 70%, Colin said, his eyes moving back to the upload panel. The 3 red bars had advanced significantly while we'd been watching the interior feed. The largest file, the consolidated audio archive, was tracking slightly behind the other 2, but the gap was closing. The prepaid SIM was holding its connection cleanly. No drops, no interruptions. I thought about James Park 10 minutes away with a federal team and a signed warrant watching the same encrypted feed from his end, waiting for the transfer to complete, waiting for the signal. On the interior feed, I watched Dominic finish his check of the upper floor and return to the staircase. He descended without hurrying, moved back through the main corridor, and pushed open the front door of my house with the flat of one hand. He stood on the front steps. He didn't walk toward the SUV. He didn't pull out his phone immediately. He stood still and looked not at the street, not at the gate, but at the side of the house toward the rear, toward the direction of the garden. His gaze tracked slowly along the roofline, then dropped to the path that ran along the eastern wall toward the back of the property. He stood there for several seconds, reading something in the geometry of the space that I couldn't identify from the camera angle. Then he raised his phone to his ear again. I set down the phone Colin had handed me and looked out at the river. The Cooper had gone from its early morning gray to a wide, flat brightness under the mid-morning sun. April light in Charleston has a particular quality, not the heavy gold of summer, not the thin wash of winter, but something clean and almost indifferent. The kind of light that illuminates everything with equal clarity and makes no distinctions between what deserves to be seen and what doesn't. The far bank sat low and green across the water. A cargo vessel moved in the distance, trailing a shallow wake that reached the dock in small, unhurried ripples. Colin was watching the camera feed. The upload bars had moved into their final stretch. The sounds of the morning birds in the oaks, the water somewhere distant. A lawnmower starting and stopping continued as though nothing unusual was happening on this dock. I let the quiet hold for a moment. Then I let the thing I had been holding back since we sat down out here for 3 full hours of documents and audio files and the careful, systematic dismantling of everything I'd believed about my own life, I let it come forward. Just briefly, just enough. 7 years. 7 years of mornings in that house. Coffee from a pot she managed. Pills from bottles she controlled. Papers I signed at tables where the lamp felt too bright and the pen felt too heavy, and the part of my mind that said, wait, read this again, was always somehow quieter than the part that said, it's fine, you're tired, it's fine. 7 years of watching my son in that wheelchair and telling myself it was the worst thing that had ever happened to our family. Not knowing, not being capable of knowing, in the state I'd been kept in, that the man across the breakfast table from me had been standing on his own in the dark for the last 4 of them. I had trusted her with my medication because she had presented herself as trustworthy. I had let her choose my doctor because she had framed it as care. I had signed documents I didn't read because my hands were unsteady and my thinking was slow, and every time I reached for the instinct that said something is wrong here, the instinct dissolved before I could act on it. I had not been foolish. I had been chemically prevented from being anything else. I understood that. I understood it the way you understand a medical diagnosis intellectually clearly, with full access to the logic of it. And I still felt the weight of it settle across my shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with logic. I should have seen it sooner, I said. The words came out quiet and flat without drama. I'm sorry. The river moved past below us. You did see it, Dad, Colin said. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were still on the screen, but his voice had changed register in the way it does when someone is saying something they mean completely. You just didn't trust yourself. That's exactly what she counted on. Not reassurance, not the comfortable softening of a difficult truth. Just the truth stated plainly, which was the only thing that had ever been useful between the two of us. I sat with it for a moment. Then I nodded once and turned back to the screen. 90%. The 3 red bars had nearly reached their endpoints. The audio archived, the largest file, the one that had been tracking slightly behind, had closed the gap. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, the package was almost beyond reach, almost in James's hands, almost irreversible. On the camera feed, the interior of the house was empty now. Dominic and whoever he'd brought with him had moved out of the camera's coverage area, which meant they were either outside or in the blind spots along the rear of the property. Then the exterior feed shifted. 2 figures appeared at the edge of the rear garden, the section near the old storage shed, where the formal planting beds gave way to the rougher ground that ran toward the tree line. Dominic moved with the same deliberate pace I'd been watching all morning. Beside him was a second man, taller, broader across the shoulders, wearing dark clothing, despite the April warmth. He had latex work gloves on both hands. They were moving methodically, not rushing, checking each section of the garden in sequence, working from the house outward in a pattern that covered ground without missing it. How much time? I asked. Colin studied the feed without blinking. 3 minutes to finish the upload, maybe 5 before they reached the dock path. He tilted his head slightly. The oak line will block their view until they hit the bend in the path. They won't see the dock until they are at the last turn. I looked toward the far end of the garden, where the path curved between 2 old live oaks that had been there since before I bought the property. Their canopies reached across and nearly met overhead, forming a low tunnel of shadow and hanging moss that gave way just past the bend to open ground and the dock. 3 minutes. The upload bars held their pace steady, indifferent mechanical in their reliability. Colin's eyes moved between the camera feed and the transfer panel. Mine stayed on the path through the garden. I counted the seconds in my head. Upload complete, Colin said. His voice was even, just a statement. But I had spent 40 years learning to read the faces of people who had been trained not to show too much. And I saw the micro-release, the fraction of tension leaving the set of his jaw that no one without that particular experience would have caught. And then from somewhere past the oak line, from the direction of the garden path, closer than the geometry of the space suggested it should be, came the dry, sharp sound of a branch giving way underfoot. I had thought we had 5 minutes. We didn't move. Colin's hand was already on my arm light, just the pressure of fingertips against my sleeve. But it was enough to communicate everything that needed to be communicated in that moment. Don't shift your weight. Don't turn your head. Don't make a sound that doesn't already belong to this stretch of riverbank on an April morning. We sat exactly as we were, the laptop screen angled away from any sightline coming down the garden path, the dock board solid and still beneath us. The Cooper River, continuing past in its indifferent way, carrying the morning light out toward the harbor, with no interest in what was happening 30 feet above it. The footsteps came through clearly in the April air. Leaves dry from several days without rain, compressed and released under deliberate weight, the particular sound of someone covering ground with purpose rather than speed. Steady, methodical, evenly spaced, the sound of a person who is not lost, who is not uncertain, who is working through a space according to a plan they arrived with. I tracked them by sound alone and did not look toward the path. 30 meters. The live oak canopy ended there, where the garden path made its final bend before opening onto the lower stretch of lawn and the dock beyond it. Whatever came around that turn in the next few seconds would have a direct sightline to where we were sitting. 2 men on an old pine bench, a laptop, a prepaid phone, and 4 years of evidence that had just finished transferring to 3 separate federal servers. Colin didn't move. His eyes were on the camera feed. From the slight change in his breathing, barely perceptible. The kind of shift you only detect after decades of knowing someone I understood, that what he was seeing on the screen had changed from what it showed a minute ago. I allowed myself one look toward the path. Dominic Shaw had stopped at the tree line. He stood at the edge of the oak canopy, partially obscured by the hanging Spanish moss, and looked out toward the lower garden with the absolute stillness of a man running a calculation. He hadn't seen us yet. The angle of the dock relative to the final bend in the path put us in a lateral blind spot from his current position. Visible if he took 3 more steps forward, invisible from exactly where he was standing. But he was reading the geometry of the space, the same careful, methodical reading he'd applied to the interior of the house, moving through it, cataloging it, looking for what was present that shouldn't be, and what was absent that should. His gaze tracked along the lower fence line, across the face of the old storage structure, and then slowly out toward the river, toward us. Colin's hand tightened slightly on my arm. We held. The sound came from the front of the property, not loud. This was not the aggressive all-announcing wail of an emergency response designed to scatter and overwhelm. This was a federal approach, a short controlled signal, the kind calibrated to carry cleanly across a property of this size and reach specific ears without alerting an entire residential block. In the still April morning, with the harbor breeze lying flat and the city not yet fully awake, it moved through the air with complete precision. Dominic heard it. His head turned toward the front of the house, the involuntary precise rotation of a man whose attention has been seized from the outside against his intent. For 1 full second, he was motionless. Then he moved, pivoting hard toward the east wall, back toward the service entrance he'd used, to come in the route he'd already mapped as his exit. He made it approximately 8 meters before the 2 agents who had been positioned in the rear section of the property since the previous evening came around opposite sides of the garden wall and converged directly on the path in front of him. He stopped. He looked at them, then over his shoulder, then back at them. He made no further attempt at movement. The second man, the one Colin had flagged on the camera feed earlier, broader across the shoulders, dark clothing, despite the warmth. The latex work gloves still on his hands had been following Dominic at a short distance. When Dominic stopped, he stopped. When he registered the agents and understood what was happening, he raised both hands, went to his knees on the grass without instruction, and began cooperating with a completeness that indicated a man who had rapidly run through his available options and found all of them pointing in the same direction. The agents moved with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who have conducted this sequence enough times that it no longer requires discussion or adjustment. Within 90 seconds of the first signal, Dominic Shaw was in restraints on the garden path of my property, the path he had been using to close in on a dock whose existence he had not known about until it was too late for that knowledge to be useful. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He stood in the restraints with his hands behind him and looked at the river in the distance with an expression I couldn't fully read from where I was sitting. Whatever he'd expected this day to look like, it had not looked like this. Colin and I walked back up the garden path. That sentence is straightforward. What it describes was not. We had been on that dock for nearly 3 hours, working through a body of material that had systematically dismantled and then rebuilt my understanding of every year I had lived in that house. Walking back through the old oaks, past the camellia beds along the east wall, past the low iron bench that had been there since before I bought the property, past the section of garden that looked exactly the same as it always had, while things I could not see had been happening around and beneath, it felt like more than a change of location. I had left through a rear service door that morning, following my son in silence, uncertain of what I was moving toward. I walked back through the garden with a different kind of knowing, heavier and clearer, and not entirely settled, Some things don't become manageable the moment they become visible. They just become facts, and you learn to carry facts differently than you carry uncertainty. At the far end of the garden, James Whitfield was standing beside the lead vehicle in a line of 3 dark cars that had positioned themselves across the main entrance and the side gate. He was in a dark jacket, federal credentials on a lanyard at his chest, watching us come up the path with the focused, quiet attentiveness of a man who has been running a complex operation for 2 years and has just watched it reach the moment it was built for. He gave one nod, short, certain. "Mr. Brennan." His voice was level and unhurried. "Everything uploaded clean. All 3 server confirmations came through within the transfer window. We have the complete package." He looked at Colin then, and something shifted briefly in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the particular look of someone who has known a person for a long time and is registering privately. How significant this moment is. "Nice work." Colin looked back at him. He didn't nod. He didn't return the expression. He stood in the morning light with the particular stillness of someone who has held something alone for 4 years in the dark. On the floor of a room, in a house where the person responsible for putting him there moved freely overhead, and for whom the phrase "nice work" has nowhere comfortable to land. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. I understood that. I believe James did too. He didn't press it. He looked down at his phone. The screen showed a live update from the secondary surveillance position. He read it, turned to the agent standing nearest to him, and spoke 2 words. "Where's Natalie?" The agent checked his own device, scrolled briefly, and looked up. "Charleston International, she's in the terminal." A short pause. "Gate B7, she hasn't boarded yet." We had moved back inside by the time James called. Not into the main house. The property was still an active federal scene agents moving through the rooms and the garden with the quiet, systematic purpose of people documenting everything that might be needed later. Colin and I had taken positions in the old conservatory that ran along the south side of the ground floor, a glass-walled room overlooking the rear garden that I had always used as a secondary office in the warmer months. It was separate enough from the central activity to give us space connected enough that James could reach us immediately if needed. Colin sat at the low writing table near the windows. I stood. We had been waiting for 11 minutes when my phone vibrated in my hand. "James, 11:17 a.m. I answered on the first ring. "She's in custody," he said. "Gate B7, didn't make it to the jetway." He told me how it had happened. Natalie had been in the boarding queue. James described the scene the way he'd received it from the 2 agents he'd positioned at Charleston International since the previous evening, precise and visual. The kind of operational account that leaves out interpretation and delivers only what was observed. She had been approximately 12 people back from the gate desk carry-on bag over one shoulder boarding pass already in hand. She'd checked in for the Scottsdale flight that morning, same as planned. Everything on her end had been proceeding exactly according to the schedule she'd set for herself. The 2 agents had approached from opposite sides of the queue, not running, not drawing attention, moving through the terminal crowd with the practiced unremarkability of people who know how to close distance in a public space without announcing themselves. They reached her simultaneously. She'd seen the credentials before they spoke. James said she went still. Not the stillness of someone who doesn't understand what's happening. The stillness of someone who understands it completely and is deciding in a fraction of a second which version of herself to present. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a sudden movement. She didn't do any of the things that people who have not thought carefully about this moment do. She reached for her phone. It was, James said, the most revealing thing she could have done, not because it was unexpected, but because of the automaticity of it. Not panic, not an emotional response, a reflex. The reflex of a person for whom the phone is a tool of control, and for whom control is the first response to any situation, regardless of how far that situation has moved beyond the reach of a phone call. She dialed my number. The agents allowed it to connect. Their protocol permitted a brief window enough for the call to register in the record, enough for whatever she said to be documented. They stood on either side of her in the Gate B7 boarding area, 30 feet from the window where her flight was waiting at the jetway, and let the call go through. My phone rang twice before I answered it. Not because I hesitated. I knew it was coming. James had flagged the possibility during our planning conversations, and Colin had mentioned it again this morning on the dock. I let it ring twice because I wanted the 2 seconds. I wanted to be standing with both feet on solid ground, thinking clearly before I heard her voice, for what I already understood would be the last time it could reach me. I picked up. "Whatever you think you have." she began. Her voice was exactly what it had always been. Controlled measured the surface of it smooth and even. Not the sound of a woman in a terminal being held by federal agents. The sound of a woman managing a conversation. I know exactly what I have, I said. 7 years of recordings, 3 insurance policies, a forged medical evaluation. I paused for a half second, and a man in Savannah whose file just got reopened. Silence. Not long. 3 or 4 seconds, the length of time it takes a person to recalibrate when the position they expected to argue against turns out to be different from the one they're actually facing. I had sat across from enough negotiators in my working life to recognize the sound of a strategy being abandoned and a new one being located. She found one. Her voice when it came back had shifted register softer, slower, with a particular quality that I had heard her use in other contexts and had for years responded to without examining why. The concerned quality, the worried quality, the voice of someone speaking carefully to a person who needs to be handled with care. Walter, listen to me. You're not well. You haven't been well for a long time. A breath. Colin has been isolated with this for too long. What he's telling you isn't what it looks like. I know you believe him, but you need to think about Natalie. She stopped. I looked out through the conservatory glass at the rear garden where 2 agents were still working through the space with measured, unhurried precision. The old oaks stood over the path as they always had. The camellia beds ran along the east wall exactly as they had on every morning I'd walked past them for 12 years. The dock was out of sight from this angle, but I knew exactly where it was, 30 feet over the water, pine boards darkened by weather, the place where my son had stood up and told me the truth. The most dangerous thing in any house, I said, is not a stranger at the door. It's the one who already has a key. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. She didn't respond. Not with words, not with the sound of a person reaching for a response and failing to find one. Just breath and then the particular quality of a silence from someone who has run out of positions to take. 30 seconds after the call connected, one of the agents spoke quietly in the background, and the line went dead. I stood in the conservatory with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I walked to the writing table where Colin was sitting, set the phone down on the surface with the same care I would give any object I intended to put down without drama, and placed both palms flat on the tabletop. Colin looked up at me. "Is it over?" he asked. I looked at my son standing before me exactly as he had stood in the kitchen doorway that morning, with both feet on the floor, and his eyes clear, and his posture the posture of a man who had rebuilt himself in the dark without asking anyone for permission. "Not yet," I said, "but it will be." The afternoon passed in the way that afternoons do, when everything has already happened, and the world hasn't caught up yet. Colin and I had been moved to a small hotel 3 blocks from the historic district. A quiet place, the kind that caters to business travelers and families visiting the colleges, with plain rooms and good air conditioning, and no reason for anyone to look twice at 2 men sitting in adjacent chairs by a window, watching the April light fade over the rooftops of Charleston. The mansion was still an active federal documentation scene. We would not be going back that night, and possibly not for several days. That was fine with both of us. I had called my personal attorney from the hotel room, a brief call enough to put him on notice that developments were occurring, and that I would need him available beginning the following morning. He asked 2 questions, I answered them, and he said he would be ready. That was the whole of it. Then Colin and I sat by the window with bad coffee from the lobby machine and waited. James called at 4:22 in the afternoon. "He's talking," James said. "All of it." He gave us the outline in the measured, precise way he communicated everything, not dramatizing it, not editorializing, just laying it down in the sequence it had been provided. I listened with the phone on speaker, so Colin could hear without having to ask me to repeat it afterward. Dominic had given a full account. He had confirmed the construction site in 2017, confirmed that he had accessed the North Charleston worksite the night before the scheduled inspection, confirmed that the safety hardware on the 4th floor platform had been deliberately removed. He had confirmed his own hand in it, and he had confirmed that the intended target had been Walter Brennan, not Colin. Colin's early arrival at the site that morning had been, in Dominic's own words, an outcome he had not anticipated and could not have corrected once it was in motion. He had confirmed his involvement with Natalie going back to 2015, her placement at Brennan Corp., the deliberate cultivation of her relationship with Colin, the multi-year strategy to position her inside the estate before any formal legal mechanism was set in motion. He had described it the way a person describes a business arrangement, which was apparently how he had always understood it to be. He had confirmed Richard Holt. He had confirmed the Savannah policy, the circumstances of its payout, and his role in facilitating the documentation that had allowed a man's passing to be recorded in a manner that served a specific financial outcome. He named the physician who had signed the relevant paperwork. That name, James told us, was already being cross-referenced against medical board records. He had confirmed Dr. Harmon the forged cognitive assessment and the guardianship strategy. He had confirmed the final medication swap and the timeline attached to it. He had provided the name of the supplier from whom the specific compound had been sourced. He had provided all of it. James said there was one moment partway through the session when Dominic had stopped and asked how extensive the audio record was. When the agent across the table had outlined the scope, 41 months of continuous recordings, cross-referenced with federal financial documentation and 2 years of independent investigation, Dominic had been quiet for approximately 30 seconds. Then he had continued talking. There was nothing left to protect. When James finished and the call ended, I set the phone on the table between us. Colin was looking at the window. The light outside had gone from gold to the flat, soft gray of early evening, the kind of light that settles over Charleston in spring, like something being lowered gently into place. He sat with his hands in his lap and his posture straight, the posture he had maintained for 4 years in a chair he no longer needed now, his naturally. No longer a performance, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he nodded once, a small single motion downward and back, up the nod of a person checking an item off a list they have been working through for a very long time. Not satisfaction exactly. Not relief, though. I suspected relief was present somewhere beneath it. Something more like completion. The particular quiet of reaching the end of something that required everything you had and discovering that you have in fact arrived. I understood it. I didn't try to add anything to it. We sat in the gray light and drank the bad coffee and let the evening come. The legal notice arrived the following morning. It came through my attorney, forwarded from Natalie's legal representation, a firm based in Columbia, whose name I didn't recognize, which suggested it had been engaged quickly and specifically for this purpose. The document was 4 pages. The language was careful. The argument structured, the tone of it almost impressive in its construction, given the circumstances under which it had been assembled. The central claims were 2. The first, that Colin Brennan had deliberately staged the construction incident of 2017 in order to avoid financial obligations arising from a disputed project contract, and that his subsequent period in a wheelchair had been a calculated deception designed to generate sympathy and avoid legal accountability. The second, that Walter Brennan was a cognitively impaired individual currently being manipulated by his son, and that any statements, evidence, or legal instruments attributed to Walter over the preceding 48 hours should be regarded as products of undue influence rather than competent, independent decision-making. I read it twice, thoroughly the way I read everything twice. Then I set it on the hotel desk and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet Charleston street below the morning foot traffic, the coffee shop across the road, with its line of early customers, the ordinary, unremarkable movement of a city beginning another day. For the first time since I had stood in my kitchen watching Natalie's car reverse down the driveway, I laughed. Not loudly, not with warmth exactly. A short, quiet sound, the involuntary response of someone who has seen a specific move anticipated correctly and is watching it played out anyway. "She's still playing," I said. Colin looked up from the bed where he'd been reading. He looked at the document, then at me. Then he picked up his phone and called James. James answered on the second ring. Colin read him the 2 central claims without commentary in the same flat tone you'd use to read a utility bill. James was quiet for a moment, and then he said 3 words. "Let her play." Colin looked at me. I looked at the street below. The coffee shop line had moved. The city continued. And I understood in the particular way that you understand things that have been building for a long time and have finally found their level. that whatever Natalie's legal team put in front of any judge in any jurisdiction over the coming months, they would be doing it against 41 months of audio, 2 years of federal documentation, a complete evidence package on 3 redundant servers, a signed confession from her co-conspirator, and a medical record that would shortly include independent toxicological confirmation of everything Colin had outlined on the dock that morning. It was already over. She just hadn't stopped yet. The envelope arrived 2 days later, forwarded through James's office to the hotel address he'd registered for us. It was a standard federal laboratory return, no markings beyond the agency identifier in the upper left corner, and my name typed cleanly across the front, unremarkable in every visible way which seemed appropriate for something that contained, as I already understood it, would. A precise chemical accounting of what the past 5 years had actually been. I didn't open it immediately. I set it on the small desk by the window, went to the bathroom, filled a glass with water from the tap, and brought it back to the desk. I pulled out the chair. I sat down. I drank about half the glass and set it to one side. Then I opened the envelope. The report was 6 pages. The first 2 were procedural sample identifiers, chain of custody documentation, laboratory certifications, the administrative scaffolding that surrounds the actual findings and gives them their legal standing. I read those pages the same way I had always read the front matter of contracts, quickly noting the structure moving through to the substance. The substance began on page 3. The benzodiazepine concentration in my bloodstream was, according to the report, significantly elevated above any therapeutic range associated with standard prescribed usage, the kind of accumulation that occurs when a compound is administered continuously over an extended period rather than in the acute doses for which such medications are typically prescribed. The report noted that this level was consistent with prolonged low-dose exposure, spanning at minimum several years. The second finding was a cognitive inhibitor, not a compound I recognized by name, and not one that appeared in any prescription record associated with my care. The report described its mechanism, a substance that, in sustained low doses, suppresses the function of the brain regions responsible for pattern recognition and self-trust, without producing the dramatic sedative effects that would draw clinical attention. It made the world a little slower. It made the mind a little quieter. It made the voice that said, "Something is wrong here," a little harder to hear. The third finding was lithium. Low concentration, but consistent, the kind of trace presence that doesn't produce obvious symptoms, but contributes over time to a particular kind of emotional flattening, a reduction in the sharpness of feeling, a blunting of the instincts. At the bottom of page 4, the reviewing physician's summary included one sentence that I read twice. At the concentration levels, documented continued exposure for an additional 6 months would have produced a high probability of irreversible cognitive impairment. I folded the page back along its crease and held it in my hands for a moment. 6 months, if Colin had not been watching. If he had not been making the careful substitutions since 2021, reducing the load incrementally without tipping off the person who was monitoring the bottles. If he had not found the right moment on the right morning to act 6 more months of what I had already experienced for 5 years, would have moved from something recoverable to something permanent. I thought about the morning I had stood in the kitchen and noticed that my coffee tasted right. I thought about how long it had been since something had simply tasted the way it was supposed to. I turned to the second half of the report. Colin's results were on pages 5 and 6, a separate panel run from samples collected on the morning of the arrest. The pattern was different in its specific compounds, but similar in its architecture, a sustained low-level pharmaceutical presence designed to maintain a condition rather than treat one. Substances that were not consistent with any legitimate post-injury care protocol. Substances that, in the language of the reviewing physician, were inconsistent with recovery supportive treatment and consistent with maintenance of existing impairment. They had been keeping him in the chair, even after his nervous system had begun to return. I set the report in the folder Colin had brought from the dock, the one that now contained copies of everything organized and indexed, ready for whatever it would be needed for. I closed the folder. I put the folder on the desk. Neither of us said much for the rest of that afternoon. Dr. Gerald Harmon entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutors within 3 weeks of the arrest. He provided a full account of his arrangement with Dominic Shaw, the nature of the assessments he had been paid to produce, and the specific instructions he had been given regarding the cognitive evaluation at MUSC Health following my hospitalization. In exchange for his cooperation, the charges against him were reduced from the full scope of what the evidence supported. He would not serve the sentence he might otherwise have served. He would, however, never practice medicine again. His license was revoked permanently by the state medical board within 30 days of the agreement becoming public record. Whatever he had been before Dominic Shaw found him, he would spend the remainder of his professional life being only what he had chosen to become. The trial transcripts arrived 3 months later. James had arranged for them to be sent directly complete records, everything in the official federal format. The kind of document that reduces months of legal proceedings to hundreds of pages of time-stamped exchange. Colin and I received them at the new address we'd established by then. We were not present in the courtroom for any of the proceedings. That had been a considered decision, and I had not second-guessed it. We read them together, sitting at the kitchen table of the place we were renting, while longer-term arrangements were sorted. Colin made coffee. I turned the pages. Natalie had accepted a plea arrangement. 22 years in federal prison across multiple consolidated charges. Conspiracy to commit financial fraud, elder financial abuse, tampering with pharmaceutical compounds, and a separate charge related to the circumstances of Richard Holt's passing in Savannah, which the reopened investigation had produced sufficient evidence to support. Her attorney had negotiated the terms over 6 weeks. She had signed the agreement without going to trial. Dominic had not accepted any arrangement. He had exercised his right to a full trial, a decision that his attorney had apparently advised against, and that Dominic had overridden. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was returned on a Thursday afternoon. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. I read that line and I stopped. Not for long. A second, perhaps 2. The kind of pause that isn't hesitation, it's acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a weight that has finally been set down in its permanent place after being carried for a very long time across a very long distance. I folded the transcript back into its envelope. Colin was watching me from across the table. "Is it enough?" he asked. I placed the envelope on the table between us, flat and even, and left my hand resting on it for a moment before I looked at him. "It's final," I said. "That's enough." 4 months after the morning Natalie pulled her carry-on down the staircase and out the front door, I stood in the main sitting room of the Charleston estate for the last time. The rooms had been cleared, the furniture either moved to storage donated or sold through an estate liquidator Colin had found. The built-in shelves in the library were empty, the books boxed and sent ahead. The camera housing that Colin had installed in the hallway clock was gone. The clock itself had been left behind at my specific instruction. Some objects carry too much of one version of a place to belong in a new one. The estate had been confirmed as mine by the court. The financial authorization documents the partial transfer agreements. The power of attorney instruments, all of it, had been voided as products of undue influence. Executed while the signatory was operating under medically documented cognitive impairment. The property had never legally changed hands. The lien that Natalie's attorneys had attempted to establish against the assets during the brief period when her legal strategy was still in motion had been dismissed within 10 days of the toxicology report entering the federal record. I had sold it freely on my own terms to a buyer who intended to restore the original ironwork on the front gate and repaint the exterior its historical color. I had no opinion about that. It was their house now. I stood in the empty sitting room for about 3 minutes. There is a particular sound that a large house makes when it has been cleared of everything that made it occupied a kind of resonance in the walls, the floors, the high ceilings, as though the space is recalibrating itself after years of being something specific. I had heard it once before, when my parents' house was sold after my father passed, and I had not liked it then either. But disliking a sound and being unable to accept it are different things. I picked up the single key from the mantelpiece, the original iron key to the front door. the one I'd held when I first walked through this house 30 years ago, and decided it was the place I'd been working toward. I crossed the room, went through the front door for the last time, and handed it to the broker's representative waiting on the front steps. The handoff made a small, clean sound in the April morning. I walked to the car without looking back. Isle of Palms sits 20 minutes east of Charleston, across the Intracoastal Waterway, a barrier island with a long stretch of Atlantic shoreline low beach houses set back behind the dunes, and the particular quality of light that you only get when there's nothing between you and the open water. We rented a 2-bedroom house on a street that ran perpendicular to the beach, close enough that you could hear the surf at night with the windows open and smell the salt in the morning before you'd made your coffee. Neither of us had history on the island. Neither of us knew the neighbors. No one there had any particular reason to think about Walter and Colin Brennan, or about anything that had happened in a historic district house on the other side of the bridge. That suited both of us precisely. The first weeks were quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not the enforced quiet of medication. Not the heavy, muffled silence of a house where things were being concealed. Just space. The sound of the ocean and the wind in the palmettos and the ordinary acoustic texture of a small house with 2 people living in it according to their own rhythms. I slept without difficulty for the first time in longer than I could accurately date. Colin began formal physical therapy in September. There was a clinic in Mount Pleasant just across the bridge, a practice that specialized in neurological rehabilitation, with a staff that was accustomed to working with patients whose recovery trajectories didn't follow standard timelines. Colin had chosen them specifically because they asked good questions and didn't assume answers. I drove him to the first session and sat in the waiting room with a cup of coffee and a book I didn't read. He came out 40 minutes later, moving more carefully than when he'd gone in. He told me in the car on the way home that he'd fallen twice during the session, both times in the first 10 minutes, before he'd found his footing with the new environment and the therapist's approach. Both times he'd gotten up without assistance. The therapist, he said, had reviewed his intake assessment with the particular expression of someone whose professional experience is being mildly challenged by the data in front of them. You've been maintaining significant muscle mass and connective tissue integrity, she had said, looking at the assessment results. Yet for someone who hasn't had formal rehabilitation in 7 years, the structural condition is, frankly, it's unusual. How have you been doing that? Colin had considered the question for a moment. Then he'd smiled. I had not seen my son smile, genuinely smile, the kind that starts somewhere behind the eyes and arrives on the face without being constructed, since before the accident in 2017. Since before the years in the wheelchair, before the nights on the cold floor, before the years of holding something enormous in complete silence while continuing to show the world a face it expected to see. He told me about it that evening on the back porch, watching the light go off the water. I didn't say anything. I just sat next to him and let the evening do what evenings on that island did, which was to continue arriving regardless of what had come before them. My own recovery moved more slowly and more visibly with each passing week. The fog lifted in increments, not all at once, not in a single morning of sudden clarity, but gradually, the way a room becomes bright as the sun rises rather than as a switch is thrown. I noticed it in small things first. The way I could hold a thought from one end of a sentence to the other without losing the thread. The way I could read a page of a document and remember its content without having to reread it immediately. The way mornings felt like mornings again, actual mornings, with their own quality and weight, rather than one continuous dim interval between one night and the next. By October, I was myself. Not the version of myself that had existed for the past 5 years, moving through a pharmaceutical gauze. The version that had existed before, modified by what I now knew and what I had been through, older, quieter, in certain ways, more deliberate but mine. About a month after we moved in, I put a small piece of paper on the refrigerator door. It listed 3 things: medication to be taken only from original sealed packaging, verified at the point of dispensing, monthly financial statement review conducted personally. Passwords changed every 90 days with no exceptions. Colin read it that evening when he came into the kitchen. He stood at the refrigerator for a moment, then picked up the pen from the counter and added a fourth line at the bottom in his own handwriting, smaller than mine. Coffee, always make your own. I looked at the line for a long moment. Then I looked out the kitchen window. The morning was still early enough that the beach light was coming in, low and flat, laying itself across the water in the particular way it does on the island before the day has fully decided what it wants to be. The sound of the surf moved through the window glass, steady and unhurried, the way the ocean continues, regardless of what has happened on the land beside it. I reached for the coffee maker. 2 years. I know the exact date the way you know, the dates of things that have reorganized your understanding of your own life. But I don't count from it anymore. I used to in the first months, measuring distance from the morning in Charleston, the way a person measures distance from a medical diagnosis or the end of a long war, checking the calendar against memory, running the arithmetic of how far we'd come. I stopped doing that sometime in the second year, not because the distance stopped mattering, but because the present had become sufficiently itself that it no longer needed to be defined by its relationship to the past. This morning, I woke before Colin and went to the kitchen. The Isle of Palms house faces east, which means that by the time I'm standing at the counter with the coffee grinder in my hands, the first light is already coming through the window above the sink, low and pale, the particular color of early morning on the Atlantic coast, when the sky hasn't committed to blue yet, and everything is still held in that quiet, undetermined light that belongs only to the hour before the day begins. I measured the coffee with a small spoon Colin had bought at a market in Mount Pleasant, the right amount the way I liked it, no more and no less. Not because I was being careful in the way that suspicion requires carefulness, because I had learned over the past 2 years that doing things correctly is its own form of attention. That precision applied to small things is a way of being present in them. The grinder ran for 22 seconds. I poured the water at the right temperature. I waited. Steam rose from the mug in the morning light, curling upward and dissolving in the warm air near the window. I had seen this image before. Steam rising morning light, a kitchen counter, a cup held in both hands. But it was entirely different now, in the way that the same chord sounds different depending on what has come before it in the piece. I drank my coffee and looked at the water. Colin appeared at 7:30. His hair was uncombed. He was wearing the older of his 2 pairs of running shoes, and a shirt I recognized from 3 years ago. He was carrying his laptop under one arm and appeared to be in the middle of a thought that had started somewhere between his room and the kitchen and hadn't fully resolved yet. "Morning," he said, moving toward the coffee maker with the unhurried ease of someone who knows exactly where everything is. Morning," I said. He poured his coffee. He sat down at the table across from me. He opened the laptop and looked at whatever he'd been thinking about, and the kitchen settled into the comfortable quiet of 2 people occupying the same space without requiring anything from each other. That was all. That was exactly all. I want to be precise about this because it matters the ordinariness of that moment. The uncombed hair, the mismatched socks. I noticed when he crossed his legs under the table. The specific unremarkable sound of a laptop opening on a kitchen table was not something I took for granted. I noticed it the way you notice things that you almost didn't get to have, with a particular quality of attention that doesn't announce itself, but is present in everything. Colin has been working as an independent construction safety consultant for the past 18 months, operating remotely from the island. His current project, the one that has occupied most of his working hours for the better part of a year, is a monitoring system for structural safety equipment. The specific problem he's solving is detection, how to build hardware and software that registers any unauthorized interference with load-bearing safety mechanisms and flags it immediately, with a record that cannot be altered after the fact. He has never explained to me directly why he chose this particular problem to work on. He has never needed to. A legal update arrives every few months forwarded through my attorney's office. Status reports primarily the administrative correspondence that accompanies long federal sentences. I read each one when it comes to note what it says and file it in the folder I keep in the second drawer of my desk. The folder is thin. There is not much to note. I have been asked more than once how I feel about the people who are named in those reports, whether there is anger, whether there is something that requires resolution or expression or continued processing. The honest answer is that what I feel when I think about them is a kind of settled clarity. Not absence of feeling something more active than that, but less consuming than anger. Anger, I have learned, is expensive. It requires constant fuel and constant maintenance, and it takes up space that could be used for other things. What replaced it somewhere in the first year on this island was something quieter and more durable. Peace is not passive. It is not the absence of awareness or the erasure of what happened. It is the decision made again, sometimes daily, in small moments to direct your attention toward what is living rather than what has already been settled. Hatred needs feeding. The kind of stillness I've arrived at does not. Some mornings, when the light is right and the sound of the surf is coming through the window at the particular angle that makes it feel like it's inside the room rather than outside. I think about a morning 2 years ago. I think about standing in a kitchen in Charleston with a cup of coffee that tasted better than it should have, watching a car reverse down a driveway, and not yet knowing why anything was about to change. I think about the sound of footsteps on a hardwood floor above my head, steady, certain, real, and the figure that appeared in the kitchen doorway. I think about how close I came to not listening, not because I would have dismissed what Colin had to say, but because there is a version of that morning, a version that existed in the years of pharmaceutical quieting, where a voice says you're tired, you're imagining things. It's fine. It's always fine, just loudly enough to make the other voice harder to follow. I had lived in that version for 5 years. The distance between that version and the one that actually happened was thinner than I like to think about. What I understand now that I didn't fully understand then is that paying attention is not a passive act. It is not simply the absence of distraction. It is the practiced, deliberate act of being present enough to notice what is actually happening in a room, in a relationship, in a body, in a life rather than the story you've been given about what is happening. That is the thing I would carry forward if I had to name one thing. Colin looked up from the laptop and closed it. Walk, he said, meaning the beach, meaning the stretch of shoreline we'd worked into the morning routine sometime in the first month on the island. Shoes off, coffee, finished. The 40 minutes before the day's demands began that belonged entirely to the sound of the water and the feeling of sand still cool from the night. I looked at my cup. There was one last measure of coffee remaining. I lifted the mug and drank it all the way down, unhurried, tasting it the way it deserved to be tasted. Not bitter, not heavy, not laced with anything except what I had put in it myself. Just coffee. I set the mug on the counter and picked up my phone from the table. Before I put it in my pocket, I looked at it for a moment, and I want to say something directly to whoever has been with this story from the beginning. I don't know where you are right now. I don't know what time it is where you're sitting, or what you were doing before you found this. But if any part of what Walter and Colin went through has stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar or clarifying, or simply like something you needed to hear, I'd like to know. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is there right now in your part of the world. Because sometimes knowing there's someone on the other side of a story, paying attention, that turns out to be enough. I put the phone in my pocket. Let's go, I said. Colin was already at the door. The sound of the ocean came through it when he opened it. The long, unhurried sound of water that has been arriving at this particular shore since long before either of us was here, and will continue long after. We walked out into the morning. If you've stayed with me this long, then you've heard the full weight of this family story. And I want to be honest with you about something I don't always say out loud. I almost missed it. Not because I wasn't paying attention, because I had been slowly, deliberately taught not to trust my own attention. Every instinct that said something is wrong here was quieted by medication, by routine, by a version of care that was never care at all. That is the part of this family betrayal that took me the longest to forgive myself for. Not the signed documents, not the years of confusion, but the mornings I almost had the thought and let it go. So here is what I would say if I could say anything to someone standing where I once stood. Don't wait for certainty before you ask questions. Don't confuse loyalty with silence. And don't let anyone, no matter how close, no matter how long they've been in your home, make you feel that trusting your own judgment is a burden to the people around you. I lived too many years doing exactly that. Don't make the same choice I made. I believe that God places people in our lives at exactly the right moment, not always when we ask, but precisely when we need them most. Colin was there in the dark, rebuilding what had been taken from both of us, while I sat at a breakfast table and called it a normal morning. I did not know, but something larger than coincidence was working through all of that silence. I have no other name for it. This family story is not one I would have chosen, but I am not sorry for where it ended. A family betrayal of this depth, sustained over years, hidden behind routine and care, and a familiar face does not leave cleanly. It leaves changed. What you do with the change is the only part that belongs to you. The lesson I carry is simpler than the story. Peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is what remains when you have stopped feeding everything that wants to consume you. This family betrayal arrived quietly in small gestures, in routines, in the face of someone who already had a key to every room. Hatred is expensive. Clarity is not. Choose clarity even when it is late, even when it costs you the life you thought you had. This family story ends on an island with bad coffee from a lobby machine, replaced by a cup I made myself. That is enough. That is more than enough. Pay attention, make your own coffee, and never stop listening for the footsteps that matter. Thank you for walking through this with me all the way to the end. If something in it stayed with you, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop a comment and tell me what would you have done if you were in Walter's position, sitting at that kitchen table. Watching that car back down the driveway, I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you in any way, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A small note: while this story draws from real human experiences and themes that many people have faced, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style of content isn't for you, there's no pressure. Feel free to explore other videos that speak to you more.